Hi there. So in this talk today, we're going to be looking at tree roots from seedling stage all the way up to balm burlap material. We're going to find some root deformations, and we're going to talk about how to correct some of those and show you some kind of new technology, or newer technology, I guess I should say, and how to make these roots have less deformities in them and have a more fibrous root system. So to start out here, we'll kind of show you some of the worst roots that you'll see. I grew this sycamore. I usually grow these for our production class, horticultural production class, every year, and we do different root manipulations on them. So I took this from class, I put this into the field, and I tried to make the worst root system imaginable, and I did a fairly good job at that, I think. So to begin, we have what's called a J root right here. So there's a couple of different ways that this J root can occur. The most common way is if this is a field grown tree and they're planted in a row. If the plow goes down and they stick the tree down too far into the furrow, the root's going to hit that, and roots are always going to take the easiest way possible, and so it'll hit that furrow and then it'll just grow out from there. You won't get hardly any roots that go into the surrounding soil. Typically will stay right there in the furrow, and you get this J root action. This is terrible. You do not want to plant these at all because they are not long-term going to be worthwhile to keep. And so to prevent that, most folks will lift them up a little bit. So if these trees start to settle in the field, they'll lift up a little bit and keep that from happening. This can also occur in pots. So if they are stuck all the way down at the bottom and kind of rammed in there, you'll get this J root. And then what will happen in a pot actually is, instead of it continuing to grow out, it'll hit the edge of that pot, and then it'll start to circle, and so you'll have a terrible root system down there at the bottom. This is not real common, but you will find this at some points, depending on who you're buying your plant material from. And another thing that I did to this terrible root system is, we always want to plant the trees and the shrubs at the root flare. So that's where the bottom of the tree starts to flare out. The root flare on this sycamore is actually right here. I planted this all the way up to here, if you can see that, and planted way too deep. And so all these roots that you see coming out of the what should be the trunks and the stems, they're all adventitious roots. Same thing can occur if you have like volcano mulch. You'll start to get roots growing out of the trunk and of the stems. And what will happen in both of these circumstances, whether this is in the native soil or whether it's in mulch, is these adventitious roots will just continue to grow around and around, and eventually it will cut off the vascular tissue of this tree. It's either going to fall over or it's going to die back slowly due to that constriction. So we'll talk a little bit later about properly planting these trees where they're not planted too deep. So I have another example here. This was a maple tree, and this was initially put out as a fertilizer study. And these were planted in 3-gallon containers, and there were no root manipulations or root treatments done at the time of planting. And so you can kind of see here where that initial 3-gallon container started. So they didn't do any type of root pruning at all and just dropped them straight into the ground. And this is a pretty classic sign of girdling roots. So this little root right here is probably not causing any problems or many problems at this point in time. It's just growing along, trunk's going along. But as the caliper of that root gets larger, as the caliper of this trunk starts to get larger, what will eventually happen is as it girdles around that tree, it's going to cut off the xylem and the phloem, and so it's going to basically starve that tree. We also have there's a lot of studies out that have looked at girdling roots and what happens whenever you get a big wind. This is very much a weak point, and so they'll just blow right over. So it's really important to treat roots, before we transplant them into the landscape. It's much less detrimental to these plants whenever they're young to do these types of treatments. Whenever they get older, it's very difficult and costs a lot of money, a lot of time, and sometimes it's not even successful. And so whenever you're putting these plants into the landscape, it's really important to do any type of root treatments at that time before they go into the ground. If you'll recall with plant anatomy, if you think about where the vascular tissue is on a root, it's all on the inside. So that outside region is typically storage, whereas in the upper portions of the plant, so basically that root flare up, the vascular tissue is on the outside. So you have your cambium layer, and on each side of that you have your xylem and you have your phloem. So what will happen is that root, as it goes around, it's not really hurting the root because that vascular tissue is on the inside, but as it strangles the outside of the trunk, that vascular tissue is just right inside of that bark, and so that's when you get a lot of problems occur with any type of transport up the xylem or throughout the plant with the phloem. And so that's when we get a lot of dieback occur as that girdling starts to take place. So we're going to start out here looking at some young seedlings. So I planted these earlier this year. This is a pretty good example. These are some maple from seeds that I collected. I typically use sycamore in class because it grows really fast. You can get some crazy things happen to the roots. For some reason, we didn't have a very good crop of sycamore this year, so I went with maple. And so these have been sitting in a flat that I propagated them in basically since this past spring. And as you can tell, every one of these are exactly the same. There's no root growth that goes beyond here. And that's because as that seed germinated and threw out the radical, it only really had one way to go, and that was in either direction. It couldn't go down anymore. And so with that, you're already starting out with a really terrible root system. And so, if you had plenty of these, if the nursery had plenty of these flats, they'd probably just get rid of them. But there are some options. If you're planting something this small and you have a root problem like this, there are some things that we can do to treat that. And so to treat this, if you were planting something this size in a landscape, which is not common, or if you're growing them at your nursery or at home or whatever, you're going to have to make some pretty drastic cuts. And so you're going to want to get all these roots that will eventually be the J roots. So you can see that right there. There's a very good illustration of a J root. And I would actually just cut that all the way off to get that going straight. So this will require a little more TLC because you did cut a significant amount of roots off of it. But long term, this is going to be a much better selection than if we didn't do any type of root treatments at all. Okay, so we had the seedling stage that we just looked at. So what's the next step? Well, it's to transplant these up into pots. Well, traditionally, we would use closed-sided container pots. This is still by far the common way to grow plants in the nursery. But there are some kind of newer technologies out there that we can look at using. So these pots here are called air pruning pots. There are a lot of different of these products on the market these days. You know, there's probably 100 different types of air pruning pots that are available, and they all have different holes, different arrangements of holes, and different sizes, etc. So what these actually do is, as the root grows out, the root hair right here and the root cap on the very end will start to desiccate, and there's meristematic tissue right behind that root cap, so that's where all the actively dividing cells are growing. So whenever that meristematic tissue dies away due to air, back behind there you get a flush of root growth. So you have more lateral roots, secondary, tertiary, etc. roots occur on the inside of this. So this has holes on each side, and then most all of them have holes on the bottom. This is especially important for species that have a heavily taprooted habit to them. So you get rid of that taproot and you get more growth of the roots up above that. So if we take this out, if this was a completely closed container, what you would actually see are roots around this entire outside. Looks nice whenever you start to look at it. You may get this and think, well, this isn't rooted in very well. Well, as you start to break this apart, you can see that there's a really nice fibrous root system with a lot of secondary and tertiary lateral roots here. So just because it's not on the outside due to that air pruning, it pushes a lot more growth of the roots on the inside. As you can see on this pot, there's no holes up here, right? So you see how this is all matted up here at the top? And there's very little roots there in the middle. If you compare that to where the holes were, there's virtually no roots on the outside, and there's a lot of fibrous roots here in the middle. One other thing I want to point out with this selection here, you see how this root angled straight down, this root's angled straight down. I'll show you another one here. So we see a lot of roots here. We see a few roots here, roots here, roots here. Now why is that? If you look at the design of this container, there's no air hose here, no air hose here, none on the sides, and then some real small skinny ones here in the middle. So you can see where the sides were, the roots grew straight down where there were no hose. You had these thin little ones that came here, and that came from right here in the middle where those holes were, and again on the side. So this is a really good example about what happens with air root pruning. So if this was a completely enclosed container, you would see these roots all over, but you don't see them because these air holes here. So, you know, there's more and more nurseries that are looking into developing plants using air pruning pots. They actually, in the latest nursery standards, they address air pruning pots and fabric bags for the first time. And so that was really good to push to some of this new technology to develop better plant material. Go through and show you just a couple of more examples of these. So this is just a different design. Again, you can tell where there were no holes. And we'll break this apart a little bit. And those big thick roots, that's where there were no holes, and the fibrous roots are where there were holes. So again, on the outside, these fibrous roots are on the inside. So ideally we would want this whole thing to look like these fibrous roots and not have any of these guys out here. And we'll talk about how we can correct some of these issues whenever we're taking out into the landscape. And then one more from these air pruning pots, just a larger example here. of the plant. So all these were planted, they're propagated and planted this spring. We're looking at these now in the fall. So that's a pretty nice looking root system. Again, you have no hose up here, you have nice large hose on the bottom, and then you have several hoses on the side. So you get the same thing. You get these larger roots that go where there were no hose. And look at that nice fibrous root system that you have there in the middle. That's pretty ideal for transplanting out into the landscape. So the more fibrous roots that you have on a plant, the less transplant shock that you're going to have. The reason for that is you have more surface area of these fine roots, which contains the root hairs, and so it's able to uptake water and nutrients a lot better because it has more of a surface area due to all this fibrous root system involved there. So now let's compare these air prune pots to some of our traditional pots, the closed container pots, just so we can see the difference between them. So you can see here, number one, you see a lot more roots on the outside of the root ball. Number two, you see a lot more of this occurring. So this root here, pretty innocuous. You know, it's not really causing any problems. But if you can imagine 10, 15 years down the line, if you didn't do any type of root correction to this, that would continue to gain caliper, and it could start to potentially cause problems. And so this is the big deal here on the bottom. So if we took this plant, dropped it straight in the ground, all these roots here on the bottom would just continue to circle around, and they would not go into the native surrounding soils. So if we break this apart, we're going to kind of see the opposite of what we saw with the air pruning pots. So you have a lot larger roots, and they're almost all exclusively on the outside of that root ball. You know, if you look here in the middle, I mean, there's virtually no roots and not many fibrous roots at all here in the middle. So that's what these air pruning pots do for us. Now, what some nurseries will do, quite a few nurseries have started, and containers have started growing in bags. I don't have an example here today, but you've seen them. Usually they're white bags. And the concept behind those is very similar to these air pruning pots, except it's called root tip pruning. So what will happen is a root will grow into the side of those fabric bags. It'll desiccate, and then back behind there, you'll get more of a flush of root hairs, fibrous roots, and it's the same exact concept as the air pruning pots, and those are just in the bags. Some folks continue to grow plants like this and don't have any problems whatsoever. I'll use this as an example. And so what do they do? So we have this, it's almost ready to time to be put up, to be potted up and transplanted up, and upshift. So what would they do? Different nurseries have different methods of doing this. Most all of them do some type of root manipulation. Some just kind of break up the root ball a little bit. Other ones will have kind of a rake, and they'll just try to straighten these out, and that's pretty effective, actually. I mean, you can see we're straightening out all those roots that were starting to girdle. But if we look at an example like this, so this has not been washed or anything. This came straight out of the pot from the nursery. I purposely asked for the most terrible samples that they have, and so they were able to take care of me there. So what you see, this plant should have been upshifted probably 2 years ago, if I had to guess. And it's nothing but just a wad of roots. You can see so many of these roots are just starting to girdle, and it's just going to cause nothing but problems. So what do we do then? I mean, we're going to get plants like this at some point in time. Well, the method that we suggest This is based on work by Ed Gilman down at the University of Florida. And that is to actually cut 1 inch around the root ball on all sides, including the bottom. So cut 1 inch all the way around, 1 inch off the bottom. And just by doing that one side, we got rid of almost every one of those circling roots. And so you can still plant these, you just have to treat them in the field before you transplant them into the landscape. And it's not really that big of a problem. This is a terrible example because it would take 10 years to plant, 100 of these by cutting that much. But generally speaking, if you're dealing with a plant of this size, and so even though this is not pot bound, traditionally pot bound like we would think, it already has root deformation starting to occur. You can see those starting to circle and girdle. So if you have a machete or whatever, you just quickly knock off 1 inch around each side. There's virtually no circling roots left there. So when you get this in the field, on especially all the trees and even most of your large shrubs, I recommend this, is to just cut 1 inch around the sides, 1 inch off the bottom, and you're going to prevent a lot of those root deformations from getting bad as these plants get older. All right, so this is a Camocyprus, by the way, is what that is. I'm over here recording this in Hort Park, and we have a couple of nice examples of Camocyprus here in one of the gardens. I encourage you guys to come visit this place if you're ever up near campus. It's a really nice area. So let's see what's going on with this hydrangea. Doesn't look too bad. This might be one that you can just ruffle them out and they'll be okay. But to be on the safe side, again, I always recommend doing that 1 inch cut just to make sure that you're not getting any of those circling and girdling roots. All right, so now we'll talk about some balled and burlap material. We have a couple of what not to do examples here that we'll talk about. So, this is kind of a not great looking plant right now. And it looked nice and green when I got it from the nursery. But if you have guys running crews and they're not properly putting plants to where they're not getting wind damage, you can get something like this. I purposely let this guy stand up in the back of my truck for the last 2 days driving 60 miles an hour, and you can see the type of desiccation that has occurred with this. So always make sure you have your plants tarped if you're going any kind of distance at all. So with balled and burlap material, we have a boxwood here, and we have a taxus back there. I'm not going to show the taxus today. They have very similar root balls on them. So what's the most common question that we get about planting balled and burlap trees? You guessed it. Do we take the wire basket and the burlap off? I had a speaker for Indiana Green Expo a couple of years ago. He came up, and he's now at the University of Florida, but he did the research on if you leave the wire and the burlap on or if you should take it off up in Wisconsin. At the end of his talk, he said, for those of you who came in today thinking that you should take the wire basket and the burlap off, you're right. If you came in here thinking today that you should leave them on, you're also right. So what that tells us is he found no differences in the study of whether to leave them on or leave them off. So with that said, one of the things, what we recommend here at Purdue, number one, always take that string off. So if this had a wire basket attached to it, there would be strings around it. Definitely always take that off. The reason why, a lot of times it'll be up here against the trunk of the tree, and if you don't remove that and it's synthetic, it's going to girdle the tree, and in a couple of years it's going to die. Those synthetic materials are not going to break down, so they're going to stay attached to that ball for a really long time. So take the string off, first of all. Number two, you want to pull the burlap back. I apologize, these are very old root balls that I asked for, and they had very little burlap on them. So you pull the burlap off there. There's two reasons to do that. Number one, when water hits that burlap, sometimes there will be a wicking action. So if it's been really dry, that burlap can actually wick the moisture away from the top of that root ball and won't let it percolate into the soil. But number two, probably even more important, is we need to see how deep the tree is planted. So most balled and burlap trees are going to be planted too deep. The main reason that occurs is if the nursery tries to not rely as much on herbicides and they use more conventional methods like cultivation. As they take the plow down the row, they're going to push dirt up next to this trunk. They go down the other side, they're going to put dirt up next to that trunk. And so whenever they go to dig these, they take most of that dirt off, but there's still some left on there. And so that's why these plants tend to be planted a little bit too deep whenever they're in the balls. So as you pull that burlap back, what you need to do is start scraping the soil back. And what you're looking for, number one, is that root flare. So we got down to that root flare right there. So that's the correct depth. Sometimes if it's a smaller species, in terms of how large it is, if conifers, for example, both of those may not have much of a trunk flare, if any. So what do we do then? Well, we'll dig back until we find the top most root. So you want to find that top root that's coming out from the trunk, and that's how deep it needs to be. So at that point, you know that, okay, this is now, this balled and burlap tree is now at the right depth. So what do we do next? We recommend, if there's wire on it, to pull that back about a third of the way down. A couple of things with that. Number one, you don't have a lawsuit on your hands. If a mower clips that wire basket, because it is going to shift, you're not going to have that worry. If somebody trips over it, you're not going to have that worry. But also, most of your fine root hairs are going to be in the top about 6 to 8 inches of the soil. And so by not having anything restrictive there for those initial root hairs, which is going to help you reduce transplant shock, remember, the more root hairs that you have, the more root area that you have, the better it's going to be for the tree. The welds in those wire baskets, they break pretty quick. They rust and break pretty quick. And so you don't really have any type of those problems. Those roots will grow right through those and not have any problems. Now, if you went in and you took all the burlap off, the wire basket off, depending on how freshly dug that was and what type of soil conditions that the nursery has, you can pull all that off and go to lift that tree and the whole entire root ball fall apart. That's not good at all. Think about how many roots are lost in the digging process to begin with, maybe 75% or greater. And if you do that, you're planting basically a bare root tree that had just lost a bunch of roots. And so we want to try to keep this intact as much as possible, because if we don't, then it's going to cause, you're going to have to spend a ton of time on watering that tree, staking that tree, etc. And it's just going to take a long time for it to really settle in and be able to start growing. So leave that wire basket and the burlap on, just pull them back down. And then you can do those treatments to the top like I mentioned. For a lot of species here in the Midwest, you know, we have really heavy clay soils. And so for balled and burlap, and even on some species that are that can't stand wet feet with potted material, you want to actually plant those just a little bit higher than grade. So, you know, instead of straight up next to this soil, that's how deep you want it, you may want to come down a couple inches, because that will settle. And if you dig a hole in some of the soils we have here in Indiana and throughout the Midwest, and you get a heavy rain, that's going to be a bathtub for a couple of days before that water is able to get out of that hole. And so by putting those up just a little bit, you're able to allow it to get oxygen, even though we may have some kind of poor drainage.